Hello and welcome to another episode of Smart Talk. Today we're talking once again about Zohran Mamdani. Now, the last time we discussed Mamdani mania was before the mayoral elections, but since then, Mamdani is, of course, the new mayor of New York City, the home of Wall Street. And since then, he's also had a fairly amicable meeting with Donald Trump in the White House. And the internet has gone crazy over the vibes between him and Trump. And while this meeting did disappoint some on the left, I believe the majority opinion is still that Mamdani represents a step forward. That his victory signals a leap in consciousness, a turn to the left, and a basis to build the fight back against billionaires. Our comrades in the US don't really think so. And in fact, they argued in their post-election article that chasing after Mamdani is going to make things more difficult. It's going to make it more difficult for the left, make it more difficult to fight the billionaires. And in fact, they argued that Mamdani is providing the billionaires a great service. So in this episode, we want to try and get to the bottom of this, or dig a little bit anyways, by asking a crucial question. What exactly does Mamdani's victory mean? So to discuss this, I've got with me once again Michael Davisson, editor of Workers Vanguard, and Lital, who are both joining me from New York. Hello, comrades.
Hey.
Hello.
Hi. So first things first. What's your take on the Mamdani-Trump meeting at the White House? Is their jolly interaction the definitive proof that Mamdani is not a socialist or that Trump is not a fascist?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously it was a big spectacle. And for some, it was kind of the logical outgrowth of the way they were positioning themselves. But for a lot of people, it was very confusing because for many months, the two sides had been shouting, Trump shouting communist lunatic and Zohran in turn denouncing Trump as a fascist and despot. But they found kind of a common ground in the sense that there's an affordability crisis that's racking the country, and that could create real trouble for the ruling class. And both sides want to try to get ahead of that, but it's clear that there's kind of that recognition that this is something that can't be allowed to fester into kind of explosive discontent that could be given a political direction that would, cut against and threaten Wall Street and challenge Wall Street in a real way.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of funny, because a lot of people were quite confused by what happened, what took place. And I think, one thing to understand is right before the meeting with Trump, Mamdani had gotten the commitment from Jessica Tisch that she would stay on as the police commissioner, which was actually a big deal for the Democratic Party establishment and Hochul, who I think suggested that to him as a key way to keep the bankers and real estate and powers that be comfortable with his mayorality, but also with Trump too. Like Tisch is very close to the Trump family. I think Trump said that was like Ivanka's best friend or something. I don't know. But that was a big softening thing, that preceded their meeting at the White House. And I think also like part of, I don't know, how did the young kids talk about aura farming or whatever, but, that was part of the thing about, Mamdani was like excelling in aura farming, which is just really another word for charisma, but he wooed Trump with his,
Right.
skillful whatever. And other, and then you have other people that are like, no, Trump got, you have right wingers that were like, Trump got Zohran to bend the knee. And I think the truth is more in the middle of what, of actually, I think they have they made a deal, basically, I mean, that's what Mamdani said is, we have our differences, Trump too, but we're going to focus on certain, things that he campaigned on. They talked about, Con Ed prices, bringing down the electricity prices, which are a huge deal for people like around the country, not just in New York City. So I think there was there's an understanding, but it was a funny thing because, for Zohran himself had been calling Trump a fascist, despot, whatever, and it's kind of to then just be smiling, whatever, with somebody that you think is a fascist is kind of jarring for a lot of people. But I think that really is kind of what's behind, his whole program actually is to focus on the economic populist aspects and not deal with all the other questions, immigration, police terror, all these things that are a big deal, and the things that Trump had most concretely threatened New York with.
Yeah. Of course, you guys wrote the statement following Mamdani's election. It's called What Mamdani's Victory Really Represents. But since then, there's this meeting that's kind of, it had its moment. The reason why I wanted to start with that meeting is in many ways, it is a real, concrete expression of maybe what his victory represents. Maybe not. I don't know. I think that's kind of what I want to probe. Lital, you already touched on Jessica or Tisch, right? The New York City police commissioner, and Mamdani's basically agreeing to keep her on. And I don't know, maybe we can just step back a little bit and just start with okay, the left is still very much gaga that this is great. But how do we make sense of his victory? What does it represent? Obviously, you guys live in New York, but from the outside, it's not so clear what these dynamics represent. So let's just start with that.
Well, the starting point is kind of the recognition that it is, becoming increasingly, increasingly difficult to get by, both put food on the table and a roof over one's head for your average worker in this city. And that's been the case for many years, but it's become particularly intense in recent, but it not just in the working class, but in kind of what, among students, young professionals, kind of a whole layer of what one might call the middle class is kind of being squeezed and priced out of the city. And that, in fact, turned out to be the kind of his strong base of support, who he particularly kind of spoke to and animated, and or both the base of this kind of volunteer army that can door to door on his behalf, but also, got out the message on social media and so on. So that cost of living crisis, it affects kind of not all social layers. Now, the left tends to present this outcome as working class as having kind of made a turn in both consciousness and in willingness to fight and so on. But if you look at the actual, who was mobilized around the campaign, who went door to door for Zohran, who was at his campaign rallies, it was really that kind of lower and middle class layer. And the fact that he didn't have the working class is obviously essential, because then the only way this affordability agenda is going to have any mechanism for realization, without the kind of the social force of the working class, is going to be through making kind of the deals with Wall Street and the billionaires. And
what's been the reaction from the bankers and the landlords? Obviously, I think it's evolved a little bit since the start of his campaign to now, I assume. But what's been the general reaction? Because obviously, one of the rallying cries of the left is that, well, this guy's going to lead the fight against the billionaires. So how are the billionaires reacting?
Well, there's like the Soros Jr. What's his name? Alex Soros. Who
it doesn't matter. Soros Jr.
right away when Mamdani won, congratulated him, hugged him, took pictures, whatever. So there is a wing of those guys that think it's better to push illusions with this guy as a way to calm down any kind of actual class upheaval or dissent at what is happening. But a lot of the guys that were bankers and others who were very, really very anti-Mamdani and hysterical about it and poured lots of money into Cuomo's campaign, again, especially after Tisch was agreed to be the police commissioner, they're all pretty much open to wanting to work with him and see what, because I think it's pretty clear that he's not really doesn't he doesn't cross any red lines. Like, he's not going to be that much, as was previously pushed. He's not going to be as much of a threat. And then, like, who he's been appointing to his transition team. And then now he's done a number of appointments for his, when he's mayor. So, for example, the one on housing literally has the guy who's the president of the real estate board, New York.
Oh my God, are you serious?
Major. Yes. So now there's like a lot of people on this, so it's a mix. Of course, some of the people are more liberal or, but there's also but there's a number of them are just straight up like capitalist real estate baron interests, And so, they obviously, why are they part of it? They understand that they have an interest here as well in what's being promoted. So I think
you guys,
that's
you guys actually touch on the housing question as one of the things that he really pushed, to make housing. I mean, New York is absolutely bonkers when it comes to housing, right? And this was really one of his things that he fought for to make it more affordable, etc. So, how does he even manage to pull this by putting the president of the real estate boards and so on this commission? How, I don't know, does he think people are stupid? How does this really fly? How are you going to fight for housing in New York of all places by having these guys sit on the boards of the thing, of the committees that are supposed to make that stuff happen?
Well, I mean, to be fair, he never claimed that he was going to take on the real estate, magnates and whatever. He was very clear on like one thing, which was a rent freeze of rent stabilized apartments, which, are about like 40% of
the housing
of apartments. And so, that's not like a crazy radical thing, and like the article points out that de Blasio did that for 3 of his 8 years in office before him. But, there's a lot of real estate interests that are not happy at all the like restrictions to building and, and there's a wing of the Democratic Party. I don't want to get all into it, but it's like Abundance. There's a book by Ezra Klein, this other guy. But part of their whole thing is that if you build more, if you get rid of all these restrictions and like climate issues and whatever that are, barriers to building more housing, then you can build more housing and then that will lower prices. Of course, that's not actually how that would work. And what it would do is actually just build more housing for profit because no one is actually coming up against that issue, which is really the key issue as far as housing access. So it's totally compatible, with what he's putting forward to have some kind of, image that these guys are going to do their part to address, the housing shortage and lack of affordable housing, because a lot of these guys say that they want to do that anyways. It's also, we noted this in the article, but, a big base of support for Zohran is like professional, very well educated layer that even can make a decent amount of money and still cannot buy property, have the house, have the apartment, whatever.
Progressive middle class people.
Yes. And so that's kind of a more recent phenomena, and so their interests are not like how to have like housing for the working class. It's a different, that's not really their shtick, it's about how do they get some of these nicer homes, whatever, and so within the framework of capitalism and real estate profits and interests, what they're putting forward, what Mamdani puts forward, and what, these other quote progressive housing people put forward is not in any way incompatible with capitalist housing,
I mean, you mentioned that part of his base includes the sort of more progressive, professional, middle-class layers as well. And even in the previous episodes, we've done a couple on Mamdani now, but even in the previous episodes, one theme throughout these discussions was really, there's a real absence of the working class who look to him. And you guys note in the article that even though this was like one of the largest turnouts for a mayoral election in decades, and, of course, Mamdani had most of the share, even Cuomo increased his share, especially amongst working class neighborhoods. So I wanted to talk about where's the working class at in this picture.
Well, the working class certainly didn't turnout and the huge numbers. The left and Mamdani himself, his DSA backers, present his campaign and his victory as kind of the result of basically a tidal wave of kind of working class support and enthusiasm for his affordability agenda. The left kind of further elaborates that this kind of reflects kind of an embrace, a leap in class consciousness and an eagerness to, fight it out with the billionaires. And there's actually, if you actually look at kind of day-to-day life in New York City and events, there's like nothing to actually substantiate that. So, the working class, as it normally does, by and large, didn't vote in this election. Those who did, there was some working class support for Mamdani, but not, like I said, not the overwhelming numbers. Those who did vote for him were generally expressed kind of skepticism that he's going to be able to deliver, or that are very dubious that any of these free services like free buses or free childcare are going to truly be free. They there's kind of this they've kind of been through these things before where they always end up having to pay, workers always have to pay for anything in everything. And so the kind of the bottom line is that when you look at the level of kind of protest activity, whether it's for kind of working defense of immigrants or defense of the Palestinian people, like the level of protest in New York City is indistinguishable from the rest of the country, which is to say it's those protests have been small and isolated and very much under kind of liberal kind of leadership. And the level of strike activity in the class is also at past in 2023, 24, strikes are actually, there's a bit of a strike wave in this country, but that's completely bottomed out. And New York City, again, is no different than the country as a whole in this regard. So the working class isn't out there in the streets. The working class didn't turn out in mass number at the polls, and who really did, but were like the younger generation, the younger professionals, the recent graduates, who kind of found were attracted to the economic populism of Zohran's platform. And now the one thing that changed in terms of the working class between the primaries and the general election in terms of the working class is the union bureaucracy's endorsement. They overwhelmingly, the union bureaucrats had endorsed Cuomo in the primaries because Cuomo was kind of the traditional figure who the bureaucrats had worked with for years when he was the governor of New York, and they kind of had their working relationship, and he was kind of the bureaucrats went for Cuomo. But when Zohran came out on top, the bureaucrats reconsidered and ended up, most of them, not all, but most of the major union leaderships switched and gave their endorsement to Zohran. And so it did help Zohran flip some working class neighborhoods in the general election. He won some working class neighborhoods that he didn't win in the primaries, kind of as, I think in part because of that switch by the union bureaucracy, which, so in any event, that's kind of the picture. Yeah.
I want to touch on that. There's this term that you guys have used a few times now, his economic populism, right? And of course, there's a huge affordability crisis, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to link this to like what was absent from his campaign, right? So you guys note in your article, and this is not the first one, in previous propaganda that you've published, that, Zohran, he really tried to focus, he did explicitly focus on, quote, bread and butter issues, and really put all these other things about the huge attacks against immigrants. Of course, you can't talk about New York or even any of the major cities in the U.S. today without talking about ICE, right? So immigrants, Black oppression. You can't talk about the New York working class without talking about like race, right? So it's not this like abstract entity, right? This is a very multicolored working class. So he focuses on the bread and butter issues, but really puts the other stuff to the side. And this, obviously, that's a huge problem. I wonder if you can explain like what's wrong with that, because I can see that some people might be receptive to the idea like, hey, build unity on the most common denominator, right? Like build unity on bread and butter issues. This is a way to unite everybody. It's like, what's the problem with Zohran burying these other social questions?
Take just kind of the question of affordable housing, for example. If you don't put the fight for Black liberation kind of at the center of that struggle, you're basically not going to be able to make any real headway in that direction because of, the persistent segregation of Black communities in this country, the housing and the general state of the Black neighborhoods is kind of completely miserable and destitute. And in order to actually get to the point where you have affordable quality housing, a total transformation of not only the housing projects, but the state of housing in the Black community itself would mean kind of a massive investment in those communities and investment overhaul and just their whole kind of structure and nature. And not only would that be a massive kind of influx and concentration of resources in those particular neighborhoods, but it also kind of cuts directly against the kind of really core interests of the ruling class in a very fundamental way, because the forcibly keeping Black people kind of at the bottom has been kind of the ruling class's time-tested way to drive down the conditions of the class as a whole and ensure that it doesn't have to provide something like quality, affordable housing to everyone. So you'll get, and this plays out with the working class more broadly in driving down wages in work conditions and keeping the Black section of the population at the bottom. And so if you're not focused, so in order to bring the working class up in any meaningful way to achieve something like quality, affordable housing for everyone, means kind of directly taking head on that segregation and that forcing of the Black people to the bottom. But if what you do, like Zohran, is kind of sweep that to the side and be just like, okay, we're just gonna we just want to talk about the need for housing without addressing kind of these kind of core questions that prevent and make it so that everyone isn't, that are kind of fundamental obstacles to achieving quality, affordable housing for everyone, then you're never going to be able to make any real headway. And that's, true for the immigration question is when you talk about the affordability of things too, because much of the reason why the things are unaffordable, I mean, one side of it, of course, is inflation and rising prices, but also kind of the conditions on the job and the workplace and wages and so on is kind of the other side of that, and the two go together. But the fact that the immigrant population is being terrorized right now, the immigrant section of the working class is being terrorized, is kind of a major obstacle to having the kind of united struggle to push back against the whole holding down of wages and driving down of conditions in workplaces. And so if you're not addressing that question centrally, you're not able to have the kind of struggle necessary to actually make a difference on these.
As you were talking, I was thinking like maybe people think it's because he's this Muslim brown man, so that maybe that's good enough, and therefore he doesn't need to talk about it. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think also there's this kind of, I don't know, denial that he didn't talk about that. You get sometimes from DSAers and others like, no, he made a video about trans struggles, or, he made another video about, or he's made points about, touch us one, touch, what is it about immigrants? Like touch one, touch all,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in his victory speech, he had a whole thing of fighting for all the different people and, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But, everyone knows that what his focus and what the main, issues behind the campaign were, economic issues. And that was very much by design as a way to, like you said earlier, unite everyone behind this set, But, if anyone is familiar with like doing work in the working class and, in the unions and whatever, that it's rife with division, and racial division is a key division that is used to keep the class divided. And it's never worked to actually, you won't actually get like united class struggle unless you actually do the work to unite the class,
Right,
which
right.
means taking on racial oppression.
Yeah, you can't just ignore it and hope it's going to go away.
Right. Because that fuels a lot of bitterness too, because it's not made up.
Right.
What Black workers suffer on the job and in daily life is not in their heads. It's a very real forced segregation, and condition that, telling a Black worker, well, just put that away, we're going to get a rent freeze. This is not going to actually be very convincing. But also, if the argument from the left, because the left is like, their whole thing is, the Marxist left is like, Mamdani promises these things. These are a first step, and what we really need is a working class movement behind him that keeps him, accountable to take on police terror, to take on immigration raids, to do all of that. And, but the thing is the working class is not going to mobilize in the streets in its own interest if there is not a force that is actually, providing a real alternative that actually champions these causes, And, the thing about, I thought, like, with Mamdani, I mean, he ran as a Democrat. In that sense, it's a little different. But, like, the whole history of the social democracy in the U.S. and like the, Socialist Party pre-World War I, is this history of raising that it's just an economic question between, the workers and the capitalists, and basically a colorblind position at best, right? That was Debs, who Mamdani had some whole quote of in his victory speech. Now, in Debs' defense, he was an independent. He ran as an independent. He did not run. He ran against the Democrats and the progressives and whatever at the time. There's this kind of there's this DSA or rightist Eric Blanc, and he's an academic in history, but he writes a lot about the working class history and whatever. And he recently has all about Mamdani, and he's very hard that this is the way to win, is to focus on the economic, and not the woke stuff and whatever. But so he's lately been like rehabilitating Victor Berger as the example of socialism in Milwaukee. And he recently tweeted that socialists in the U.S. today have a lot more to learn from Victor Berger than Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, or Chairman Mao. That's like his thing, because they want to get rid of the quote left that's left in the DSA.
That gives you a real sense of where the DSA
but
is.
It does,
at.
yes, and it does in particular on the Black question too, because Berger was a white supremacist.
Oh my
he
God.
really thought that Black people and Chinese immigrants, whatever, were a like quote inferior race. Like, I'm not making this up. And and so, but that was the thing about the SP. It didn't matter. Everybody was in one party, and but I do think that the fact that he is the guy that Blanc is trying to rehabilitate as the great example of how Mamdani can create socialism in New York City is really telling, because Cannon wrote a lot about the Black question and the problems of the early SP, and that was really a key thing, is that they really had nothing to offer Black workers. And anyways, I like, it's to me like that this is the guy that is being promoted as an example of how you can focus on economic stuff and not deal with these questions is such a telling statement of where these people see as like what socialism is or the future. And it's honestly a reason why it's very discredited to a lot of Blacks and others to be why, everybody's like, why is the DSA so white? Well, I mean, if this is like what you're promoting, it's not really gonna attract. And so now Mamdani is like Democrat, and really quite more to the right of even Debs or whatever. But that is like the history that the DSA really, comes from, as opposed to the Communist Party, which, the Bolsheviks and Lenin, really intervened to ensure that the understanding that you had to fight for Black freedom was key to the fight against, capitalism in the U.S. That came from the Russian communists.
Yeah, I mean, bottom line is like, if you want to try and make any advances for working people anywhere in the US, you have to address the central question, which is racial oppression. And,
Yeah.
by ignoring that, you're really like ultimately that's one, not going to unite the working class, of course. But I think, as you just said, Lital, Black folks are going to look at the DSA and be like, oh, well, why am I going there? Like, what do they have to offer? That's not to deny that there's probably Black youth in the DSA
There
and so
are.
on. But, it's not like something that stands out to them. Like, this is where I go to fight for Black rights, for Black equality, et cetera. Like, it just isn't that.
Yeah.
But speaking of the DSA, let's talk about the mothership. So we've talked about the Democrats a little bit here and there, but you write in your article that the future direction of the Democratic Party remains unwritten, but Mamdani's focus on bread and butter issues while putting wokeness in the backseat is a distinct possibility. So I guess what you're alluding to there is that Mamdani's strategy might give us a bit of a clue as to where the Democrats might go in the future. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, this election was kind of the Democrats hailed it as a blue wave rebuke of Trump. And obviously Zohran was the most kind of spectacular victory, but even the moderate Democratic governors of New Jersey and Virginia kind of rode to victory on the basis of cost of living issues. And it's kind of recognized, I think, within the Democratic Party that bread and butter issues are deeply felt right now. Trump himself obviously kind of rode to the White House in 2024 by focusing a lot on the misery of working people under the Biden administration and promising on day one that things would be different for them. And they, of course, haven't been any different. And in fact, people have tightened their belts further and further. And so Trump's popularity has dropped. And there's a certain recognition in the Democratic Party that's the direction, the bread and butter issues is the way to go. And to kind of steer clear from the identity politics and the woke, which really turned off large sectors of the population, which basically was told that they were to blame for others' miserable condition, even while they themselves were falling deeper and deeper into, economic ruin. And so that definitely did not wash and created a very massive backlash against liberalism within the working class and broad layers of the population, which happened to intersect the ruling liberalism outliving its usefulness for the ruling class as a whole as well. But so the Democratic Party, I think, kind of views that, like we just said, that kind of continued hammering on the bread and butter issues as like the way to go. And Trump has a sense of that too, because he, right after those elections, he immediately tried to reclaim the whole message of affordability. And that meeting with Zohran in the White House was part of his angle of trying to steal the thunder back on affordability from Zohran and the Democrats.
Yeah,
Sure. I mean, like Trump's in the lead up to these elections, Trump's popularity was really taking a beating, and he got elected because he promised that he would have answers to a lot of the economic misery that was facing the working class in the U.S. And things have gotten more expensive, gotten worse for a lot of people. So you do have a thing where they called it the blue wave or whatever, where so Zohran won the mayoralty in New York City, but also these two pretty conservative establishment, whatever type Democrats won in Virginia and New Jersey. And they also were campaigning on affordability, basically. Like in New Jersey, it was like the taxes were killing people. There was all this kind of stuff. And in New Jersey, I think her name is Cheryl, but so when she was campaigning, when she was describing the campaign, she said, I can't talk about abortion with somebody who can't pay their rent, So it's a very clear thing that they're going to focus on, these economic questions as the key thing and not talk about abortion rights or these other questions that had been more the thing that distinguished them, if there was one thing or whatever in the last elections. But yeah, so I think that is we're going to see a lot of that being the main on both sides too. The Republicans are also pushing that as their way to answer the Democrats right now.
Interesting. So, Lital, you touched on this question of accountability. I want to talk about one of the subheads in your article says, let's see to whom Zohran is accountable. Now, I mean, look, he's in office, so let's deal with reality as it is. So you have some proposals in terms of how to do that, because it doesn't help to just denounce this guy for being like, okay, well, he's in Democrats, which is true. It's pretty rotten. But like, okay, all of these things, like he's not really a socialist, etc. But it's like, okay, he's in office. We have a job to do as socialists on the ground. Let's hold him accountable. So do you want to motivate what you mean by that?
So, obviously we know he's a Democrat. He's made absolutely clear, increasingly through the primaries and even more so between the primaries and the general elections, that he was going to play ball with the billionaires. He distanced himself from his kind of past rhetoric on the cops and other potentially explosive issues. On the Palestinian question, he kind of backed away from globalize the Intifada, recognize that Israel has a right to exist. So even though he kind of was viewed as being on the Palestinian side, he tried to make peace with the Zionists, which obviously dominate the Democratic Party and are a major factor in New York City politics. And by the same token, declaring how he doesn't think there should be billionaires, but he was willing to work with them and showing in various ways his willingness to do so. And probably with the cops, the most kind of telling thing was even before the elections, looking to keep Tisch on as the police commissioner. So we know absolutely kind of what he's doing and where he's headed, and he himself has been very upfront. I want to kind of revitalize the Democratic Party. Now, at the same time, he does proudly declare himself a Democratic Socialist. And so the DSA basically almost universally is solidly behind him. And, as we've been discussing throughout, most of the Marxist left is kind of head over heels about his win as well. They may be a little more critical of him, especially the Democratic Party affiliation, but they think the movement around him is basically the grounds for an independent, socialist movement, right? And so in this context of where his allegiances really lie, or how do we actually make some headway and be able to sort out for those who are kind of under the spell of Mamdani mania, where he does actually stand. One option is obviously just to say, he's a Democrat, class collaborationist, blah, blah, so on and so forth. And while that is all true, that isn't really going to convince anybody who thinks that Zohran is a socialist and that he's different and so on. And so, but at the same time, people are including DSAers, are upset about some of the moves he has been making. And Tisch is probably the one that's been hardest to swallow by his supporters on the left, including in the DSA, because Tisch basically the living embodiment of everything a socialist is supposed to be against. She's a billionaire, a Zionist, a collaborator with ICE. Wants to pour more cops onto the streets to rampage through Black and Latino neighborhoods, and so this doesn't sit so well with much of the DSA left, and of course a lot of Marxists are denouncing, other Marxist groups are denouncing us as well. So like I said, accountability wise, obviously to get where Mamdani is, you're really only accountable. You're only really going to be accountable to one force, which is those who call the shots in the Democratic Party. That is Wall Street, right? But the DSAers think that he's a DSA member and he should be accountable to us. And again, this is despite the fact that he's like said, I'm not standing on the DSA program. I'm that's not me, and so on and so. But the DSAers really like, okay, he's ours and he's a principled socialist. So how do you prove he's not? Well, we propose, so you think you can hold him accountable. Let's try to do so and see what happens. And let's do so, in a serious way. So we know Tisch is extremely bad news, is basically the very opposite of what a socialist should be doing. So let's pass a motion. Let's tell Zohran, sack Tisch, install a police commissioner who will actually kind of on day one cross some cross some actual red lines for the ruling class, right? Because of course, if a socialist mayor is supposed to be like, completely stripping away the power of the forces loyal, the police forces loyal to Wall Street, and building up kind of working class self-defense to replace them. So let's sack Tisch and put in a police commissioner who cross these red lines and immediately throw open the police archives to expose the many heinous crimes of the NYPD, jail all the killer cops, and declare that you're not going to enforce the anti-strike Taylor law, which is a major weapon that's used to prevent or stop strikes by city workers. And these are very basic measure. These would be very basic things, but they're easily doable if you're actually, if that's actually what you're looking to do. And so that's what we're proposing, and for the DSA left, it's a way to kind of demonstrate. Let's put up a motion to this effect and see where Zohran actually falls. And from there, kind of reach actual conclusions about who he's actually accountable to. And it also draws a line against kind of the broader Marxist left too. I'd point out because like I said, they're all very enthusiastic. Almost every left group is very enthusiastic about his victory. Views this as the transformative within the working class, as the material for a rising socialist movement. At the same time, they have criticisms of Zohran, and in particular the Democratic Party affiliation. And the one thing they don't do is talk about how the movement around Zohran right now, this electoral movement, how you're going to go from that to an independent working class or independent socialist movement. And so again, this is a way to is a very kind of preliminary step to kind of pose the question in a way that people can actually see that Zohran is actually on the other side of the class line, because to build that kind of independent socialist movement will mean needing to draw a line against Zohran and his strategy of economic populism. So,
Yeah.
I was just gonna the Marxist left, groups, Left Voice, Socialist Alternative, PSL, even, everybody was very excited about Zohran's victory. I think SALT actually called before the election for people to vote for Zohran. PSL didn't really do that. Left Voice did not do that. But once he won, everybody had agreed that this was this big moment for socialism and whatever. But then, every day he does whatever he does, there's a new, they're like, why is he doing this? And, Left Voice will have a new post on Instagram, every day.
Right. The latest is on Hakeem Jeffries.
Yeah, why is Mamdani endorsing anti-socialist pro-genocide Jeffries, He's letting down all the people who voted for him. He's, and it's he's very clear why he's doing it. He's like, this is the deal I have so that I can get, Hochul and these people to maybe do a little tax on corporate or whatever so we can get some of these things that I promised, He's very clear. That is what he is trying to do. And so you have this kind of, I don't know, it's kind of gaslighting. I don't know, where everybody is like, no, but he really has a socialist, agenda and what he's pushing. So, instead of just being shocked or whatever, the point of having something concrete to say, fine, he's a socialist mayor, fine. This is what, if he was, this is what, he would do, is fire Tisch and get somebody who's going to actually open the archives, jail the killer cops, and actually make an impact against police terror. The day of the election, Socialist Alternative had a headline: Zohran's historic victory, full steam ahead to fight Trump and the Democratic Party establishment. And then you have the meeting with Trump, and then you have him endorsing Jeffries. So it's no, that's not what his victory means. And, but again, Zohran didn't really promise that much more than, you know what I mean? We said this from the beginning. It's none of the stuff he said really crossed any red lines for the ruling class. But he did talk a lot about, I'm going to be Trump's worst nightmare and we need a new whatever. But so there's, I think there's a lot of further disorientation in the left as to what is actually happening. right now. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have a number of things to say on that. Like, sure, he didn't cross any red lines, but, he did say all these, like, really fanciful things that did catch the attention of, like, a sizable layer of people in New York. I think that's one. But I think it just kind of points to, like, this is just things are so bad and people wanted an alternative. Okay. But I have to say, so I'm recording another episode with comrades from the Just Break Already caucus and the DSA, and to talk a little bit more about some of the tactics to push in the DSA, which is totally in love with Zohran right now. Even as Zohran is trying to break that relationship, they're like, no, please. But anyways, I want to say just in general, right, Michael, as you were saying, like, look, this is an accomplished fact right now. He runs New York. In theory, he has the power to do many, many things, right? Like, who's going to stop him? He can fire the police commissioner. Like, what's really stopping him except his politics and the political allegiances, the people he's beholden to, like the people who really call the shots. So I think ultimately right now, the task for socialists is to try and put forward tactics that will actually be successful at breaking the illusions that people have in him, and that will actually really polarize the left in terms of, like either going gaga over him or just denouncing him without any basis. But it's like, look, like you have to fight to actually show why Mamdani is an obstacle, to show why this is not what a socialist mayor should do, etc. I guess that was my 2 cents on what the tasks are really in the New York left, I guess in the national left. So, yeah. Okay. I think that wraps it up for me. As I said, I'm going to do a follow-up with the Just Break Already comrades to go into this a little bit more. But is there anything else that you guys wanted to end on?
Yeah, I thought there's an interesting podcast by Union Opposition and TWU Local 100 called Transit Workers for a Fighting Union. And they have like a podcast called The Third Rail. And they did an episode on Mamdani and transit. And I think it'd be useful for people to listen to that to get a sense of what transit workers actually think about Mamdani, and also the questions of like free buses and what is the actual like consciousness and mood, and how do you actually fight to like organize transit workers and the unions to actually have a defense of workers in this period, and why Mamdani is not where that's at.
Okay, that's really helpful. The Third Rail, I'll link that in the show notes. And okay, so thank you both so much for taking the time to come on and explain to us what to make of the Mamdani victory. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks.
As always, you can follow Workers Vanguard on X, on Insta, and on Facebook at Workers Vanguard, right?
Yep.
Yep, Workers Vanguard. Yeah, and do follow them on YouTube as well. I'll link all that stuff in the show notes, and we'll see you next time. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.